All right, so we have obviously been keeping track of this ongoing debt ceiling standoff between Joe Biden and Kevin McCarthy, or Democrats and Republicans generally here in the United States, as we are rapidly approaching that June 1st deadline that was set out by Janet Yellen, where we could hit an absolute economic calamity, not just here in the United States, but around the world if we fail to reach some sort of a negotiated settlement to raise the debt ceiling, which, by the way, shouldn't even exist in the first place, but we'll circle back around to that. And as we were approaching this deadline, we have hit multiple different snags. Okay, so first off here, we have Donald Trump throwing his hat in the ring and pushing Republicans to do not fold. I mean, basically what he's saying is that they should be willing to tank the entire U.S. economy in order to, in order to extract some demands for more austerity measures on the poorest and most vulnerable people in the country through programs like Medicaid and food stamps. So now I want to get to this aspect of it, because this is something I've talked about before when covering this. We had Joe Biden, it seemed for a little bit there, like he was standing firm on trying to get a clean debt ceiling passed, and not actually being willing to fold into some of those demands from Republicans. But one of the things that I gave as a caveat is that obviously we know who Joe Biden is and was throughout his career in the Senate and as the vice president under Obama. He's not a guy who was, been a principled defender of some of these social programs, and has, in fact, previously been on the front lines of trying to get some sort of bipartisan compromise in order to slash some of these programs. And it seems like this version of Joe Biden may be making a comeback right now. So here from Slate, they say he's back. The version of Biden that progressives most feared is rearing his head in these debt ceiling negotiations. So what are they talking about here? They say, to hear it from House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, there won't be a deal on the debt ceiling without work requirements. Okay, so we're not talking about slashing the Pentagon budget, the nearly $1 trillion per year financial black hole that the military budget is, okay, can't pass an audit 5 times in a row. We're not talking about raising taxes on billionaires or corporations or undoing the 2017 tax cuts. Okay, we're just talking about increased work requirements, okay, and we'll talk about how absolutely delusional and ridiculous that is here in a minute, but they say this means that his caucus wants harsh new restrictions to be placed on needy recipients of social welfare programs, forcing them to secure jobs and submit proof of near full-time employment just to remain eligible for things like food aid and health care. In other words, McCarthy is holding the economy hostage so that fewer poor Americans can access the country's already paltry welfare state. And I mean, keep in mind, obviously, I've mentioned this before, this is coming at a time where the Federal Reserve under Jerome Powell is explicitly and openly, in his own words, pushing with a policy with these interest rate hikes that is supposed to try to force potentially millions of Americans out of the workforce. Okay, so we have a Fed policy right now that's trying to slash jobs in the United States, force people out of their work, okay, at the same time that we have Congress that is looking to slash some of the programs while also implementing more strict work requirements. So you're going to kick people out of their jobs and then demand that they have work requirements to get things like food and healthcare. Okay, I mean, does it get more demented than that? They continue. They say, what is this, the 1990s? President Joe Biden seems to think so. When asked over the weekend about this GOP red line, he re-upped his previous support for welfare reform from his time as a senator by telling reporters, quote, I voted for tougher aid programs that's in the law now, but raising the work requirement age for Medicaid, it's a different story. So it seems like he's not willing to give in on Medicaid work requirements or increased work requirements, because keep in mind, there already are some of these work requirements in place. They just want them to be more strict, right? But he's apparently taking Medicaid off the table for now. We'll see how that goes in the future. They say this was a reference to his 1996 vote for the Clinton-era legislation that Clinton bragged would end welfare as we know it, that was accomplished with the help of restrictive new work requirements. They say that Biden suggested that he might be open to new restrictions to federal aid programs such as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps, or SNAP, and temporary assistance for needy families, which is cash assistance for families, in a compact with the GOP. He said that he was not open to restrictions on Medicaid, which Republicans also want. And now if they listen to Donald Trump, they may be willing to go all the way and just allow this this deadline at June 1st to pass, unless they're willing to get that, or unless they're able to get those Medicaid cuts as well. But they say it's an alarming position on a number of different levels. Decades of research have shown that work requirements have been completely ineffective when it comes to moving people out of poverty or even encouraging them to find work. In fact, work requirements may actually make it harder for people to find and maintain employment, which is obviously true. Okay, this isn't a difficult concept, right? How are you supposed to get your shit in order to go out and find a job, right? If number one, again, the Fed is currently trying to push you out of work, but number two, if you don't have the basic life necessities like food or healthcare or housing, okay, it's damn near impossible if you're put in that kind of a precarious situation to be able to even get a job. So you're making people's lives more difficult than it already is when they're unemployed, okay, as you're trying to force them to be unemployed through these interest rate hikes, right? So you're trying to push them out of work, and then you're making it increasingly more difficult for them to find work, and then you're also going to impose more work requirements to get those. I mean, it's a death spiral here, okay? They continue. They say they work only in restricting access to life-saving support and are therefore de facto cuts, which is why Republicans embrace them. Importantly, they are also a non-starter for House Democrats, according to Hakeem Jeffries, not to mention a complete disavowal of the president's own position on welfare expansion from just 2 years ago. And so they give us a little bit of a comparison here with the death of the child tax credit, which I've talked about numerous times of this channel, but it gives us just a perspective in terms of what Joe Biden was trying to portray himself as a couple of years ago when he was on the campaign trail and even towards the beginning portions of his administration versus where he's at now. So they say just how out of character is Biden's sudden pivot towards the GOP favored policy. The American Rescue Plan Act, inked just after Biden was inaugurated in 2021, featured major boosts in funding from everything from food aid to healthcare. The flagship policy of the package was the child tax credit, which was notable not just for its size but for its construction. It was critically not subject to work requirements, a feature that was touted in the first breath of the program's description as a path-breaking development in the president and the party's orientation toward welfare programs. And the American Rescue Plan, I mean, it's probably the best thing that Joe Biden has done, but again, all of those programs were temporary, and as you're going to see here, he allowed them to die. They say that the child tax credit has, ever since, been celebrated as a flagship program of the Biden administration. The income-restricted benefit, $300 per child per month, immediately cut child poverty in half. Let me say that again, okay? $300 per child per month. It immediately cut child poverty in half. Now, you could have, disagreements about how we define poverty. There's good conversations to be had about that. You could have disagreements about the methodology and how we reached, half of a number. But the point is, significantly, we're talking about millions of children in the United States were pulled out of abject poverty just from this simple policy, okay? It was like the most clear as day example as you could possibly ask for in politics in terms of we did X policy and this X benefit happened. I mean, it was right there in our faces. And yet again, we don't have the child tax credit anymore. So they say this was no coincidence. That it was immune to work requirements meant that it was easily accessible to parents. They say then the program expired after a year, and a barrage of lobbying by conservative groups just so happened to coincide with West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin having an epiphany that the benefit was going to layabouts. I mean, do you guys remember this? Joe Manchin at the time was literally trying to say that parents, okay, and we had the data on this, they were spending it on basic life necessities, right? Housing, childcare, food for their children, clothing, things like that. Overwhelmingly, that's what they were spending the money on. And he basically just made it up, pulled it out of his ass, that these parents were going to be spending this money on drugs, okay? That's what he said at the time, and used that as a justification to plunge millions of children back into poverty, okay? This is how American politics works, right? Because we can't possibly, do anything that materially uplifts working class families, because that may give them a little bit more leverage, may make them a little bit more comfortable, and a little bit less easily exploitable by the capitalist class in this country. They say he pulled his support for it in the easiest cause and effect sequence imaginable. The policy died and child poverty rocketed upward. Shocking. They say that isn't the only welfare program that's been throttled since then. In the past few months alone, numerous other programs have seen their expansions clawed back. On March 1st, as of a result of a deal that Democrats struck with Republicans in December, when they could have raised or abolished the debt ceiling but chose not to, okay, the federal government shut off enhanced food aid for 32 states, aggressively constricting benefits and leading to a massive spike in hunger. A month later, somewhere between 5 and 14 million people lost Medicaid coverage after the Medicaid expansion in the American Rescue Plan Act expired. Okay, they say in just over 2 years, the president has done a complete 180 on what Politico called the evolution of the Democratic Party, right? Oh, Joe Biden, right? He's the new FDR. That's what people were saying, right? Okay, complete bullshit. They say, as that story put it, once fearful of race-baiting rhetoric on supposedly lazy welfare queens, the party is now largely unapologetic about spending money to strengthen the social safety net. So, I mean, again, there's a little bit of comparison of how the trajectory of the Biden administration has been going, okay, with all of those other programs, right? The expanded Medicaid, the child tax credit, etc., all of those things, but it's also a glimpse into the trajectory of these debt ceiling talks. I mean, as they pointed out there, before the last midterms, when Democrats held the House and the Senate, they could have lifted the debt ceiling. They chose not to. They chose to wait until they got beaten by Republicans, then chose to wait again until Republicans took their positions in office, and now we're faced with this situation where Democrats are just, it seems like, inevitably going to throw their hands in the air and say, whoops, we couldn't do anything about it. I guess we just have to give in to some of their demands. I mean, it's so goddamn pathetic, especially considering that there are other Democrats, like John Fetterman here, who are pushing for other solutions that Joe Biden could do. Now, granted, on this specific one, Joe Biden has sort of vaguely floated the idea that he may be in favor of doing this, but there's been no commitment, there's been no fight, there's been no urgency on actually trying to get this done. So here from the Post-Gazette, they say Fetterman to Biden, forget the debt ceiling and invoke the 14th Amendment. So what is he talking about here? Let's just read it straight from the Constitution. Here is the 14th Amendment of the United States. Okay, this first line here, and especially the first and last portions of it, are the key portions that are in question. They say, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, meaning passed by Congress, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, this was written right after the Civil War, shall not be questioned. But let's just focus on the first and last portions of this. The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. Okay, so in other words, seems pretty cut and dry to me, at least. You guys can interpret that in whatever way you want to, and tell me if you disagree with me on this, but it seems pretty unquestionable, right? It is unconstitutional to have our debts fail in the way that Republicans are trying to push for right now. It is unconstitutional. You could make an argument it's unconstitutional for a debt ceiling to even exist. I mean, again, this is all based on the nonsense, bullshit premise that federal government spending works exactly like household spending. Okay, this is something that Kevin McCarthy has been coming out and saying almost every goddamn day during these negotiations, right? Oh, you know, every single American household has to balance their checkbook, and if you're putting more money out or you're spending more money than you're bringing in your income, right, or your investments or whatever the case may be, then you're going to go broke. You're going to go bankrupt, okay? That's true for an individual. That's true for a corporation. That's true even for state and local governments. You have X amount that you're bringing in. You can't spend more than that. You have a finite amount of money. It is not true for the federal government. It's a completely different dynamic. Why? Because the federal government has a monopoly over the production and distribution of the US dollar, okay? They have a monopoly over our currency. They print money, okay? Every time we need a bailout for Wall Street, they literally, at the Federal Reserve, they'll go on a computer and they'll type up the amount that they want to inject into X bank or whatever the case may be and just invent the money out of thin air. Okay, it's not as if we have restrictions where we need to bring in X amount of tax dollars and that's how much we can spend. That's not how government spending works at all. Okay, and also keep in mind, the debt that we're talking about, the national debt, okay, that's money we've already spent. All right, we're not talking about like future spending in a hypothetical future. That's money we've already spent. We're talking about paying our bills, okay? So this shouldn't be controversial in any way, shape, or form. When it comes to deficit spending, when it comes to the national debt, you shouldn't even be thinking about what is the dollar amount of our total national debt or what is the total dollar amount of our deficit right now. What we should be thinking about is what are we spending our money on? Are we spending our money in ways that are counterproductive, in ways that are ineffective or bloated or being misused or corrupted, right? Something like the Pentagon budget would be a perfect example of that. We could also talk about how we can use taxes and the structure of our taxes in order to reduce things like income or wealth inequality, right? That's why I'm in favor of taxing the rich. It's not because we need their money in order to pay for X program. It's because that would help to create a more equitable and fair society within our economy, okay? That's the reason I'm in favor of those higher taxes, right? Okay, so that's what we're really talking about. Are we spending money in ways that are going to be productive, in the future, ways that are going to expand the economy, create new jobs, right? Something like an infrastructure bill, something like the Green New Deal, for example, that creates millions of good paying union jobs, okay? Investing in our energy system and renewable energy resources, okay? Investing in healthcare, investing in education for future generations, okay? These are the kinds of things that pay for themselves in the long run, because you're making an investment in uplifting people on the bottom rung of the ladder and creating all of those jobs and expanding the economy and increasing our productive capabilities within this country. That's what this conversation, if people were acting in a good faith way, or maybe if they weren't so goddamn stupid, that's the conversation that we would be having when it comes to government spending, right? I'm not saying, you can spend infinite amounts of US dollars, right? The federal government could cut a check for $1 million to every American and everything would be fine. No, there are things you have to look at, right? You look at things like inflation. That's generally a good marker in terms of, are we overspending? In other words, are we putting more money into the U.S. economy than the economy is capable given our productive capabilities, right? That's usually a good marker. Now, granted, obviously we've been going through this inflationary period recently that's been largely driven by corporate profits and corporate greed and price gouging and all of those things, but generally you would look for other indicators. The national debt, the deficit, the debt ceiling, these are all just like sort of arbitrary things, right? Deficit spending has been done under every single president in the modern history of the United States of America. It's just about, what do you want to spend your money on? And effectively the question right now that Joe Biden is faced with, effectively the question right now that the American people are faced with is, do you want to spend our money on continuing to give tax cuts to billionaires and the wealthiest multi-billion-dollar corporations in the country? Do you want to spend that money on the Pentagon that can't pass an audit, that's $1 trillion financial black hole, okay? Or do you want to spend our money in ways that will actually materially uplift working class people? I mean, that's the real question that's on the table right now. And again, it looks like, given who we know Joe Biden has been historically, given his rhetoric as of recently, it seems like we may be heading for a situation where the Republican side of this argument is actually going to win out.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying